They said no one would come back to Pine Ridge. The storms were too cruel, the lodge too broken, and the memories far too heavy. But Eli Carter did, a soldier haunted by silence, returning to the only place that ever felt like home, even when it stopped being one. Most people saw a ruin swallowed by snow, but Eli and his loyal shepherd, Ranger, saw something else. A promise buried beneath the cold, waiting for someone who still believed in second chances. Because sometimes, the things we try hardest to forget are the very places that remember us most. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city below and subscribe if you believe in healing, loyalty, and the courage to rebuild. The air over Pine Ridge carried a faint haze of frost and pine sap, as if winter had been holding its breath for years. The mountains stood quiet and pale under a low gray sky, and a thin wind wandered through the trees, brushing past the frozen branches like a ghost too gentle to be feared. Eli Carter drove slowly up the winding dirt road that led to the old lodge. His truck, a weathered Ford from another decade, creaked and grumbled under the weight of snow, tires cracking through sheets of ice. The sound echoed off the cliffs, reminding him how far away from everything he was. When he reached the final turn, he stopped the engine. Silence rushed in, thick, almost holy. His breath fogged the windshield before fading, leaving only his reflection. A man in his early 40s, tired but not defeated. Eli's face bore the kind of lines carved by endurance rather than age. His short brown hair had grown uneven, touched with silver at the temples. A few days' worth of beard roughened his jaw, shadowing the firm angles beneath. He had a soldier's frame, broad but tightened inward, like someone still bracing for an explosion that would never come. The scar on his right hand, pale and raised, traced down to his wrist, an old burn from the desert that still ached in the cold. His eyes were the kind of blue that could look calm and dangerous in the same breath, eyes that remembered too much. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Ranger, a German shepherd with a thick sable coat that shimmered between brown and black, his muzzle lightly grayed. At 7 years old, Ranger was lean but powerful, his posture always half alert, the way soldiers stand even when they're supposed to rest. His left ear had a small notch from shrapnel years ago, and a faint scar crossed his nose. Yet his amber eyes held patience, steady, loyal, deeply human. Eli turned off the ignition and leaned back, resting his hands on the steering wheel. "Well, buddy," he said softly, his voice low and rough. "We made it." Ranger's tail brushed against the seat once, then stilled. The dog's gaze followed the outline of the lodge that emerged from the mist ahead. A 2-story wooden structure, half buried in snow, its roof sagging, the front porch cloaked in ice and vines. The sign hanging above the door still read, Pine Ridge Lodge, though half the paint had peeled away. This place had been built by Thomas Carter, Eli's uncle, the only man who ever felt like family after his parents' accident when he was 9. Thomas had been a tall, weather-beaten man with iron-gray hair, kind eyes, and hands calloused from a lifetime of work. He had once served as a mechanic for the army before retreating to the mountains to build something that lasted longer than war. He took Eli in, raised him with quiet affection, taught him how to split logs, repair engines, and listen to the rhythm of the woods. To the townsfolk, Thomas was the gentle caretaker, a man who never spoke much but always showed up when something broke. Eli hadn't seen him in almost a decade. The military had swallowed his youth, and by the time he came back from overseas, Thomas was gone. A letter from the lawyer arrived 2 weeks later. "You are the sole inheritor of Pine Ridge Lodge." Eli stepped out of the truck. The cold air struck him clean across the face, sharp enough to make him feel alive. Ranger jumped down beside him, his paws sinking into the snow with soft crunches. Together, they stood still for a moment, staring at the house that once smelled of firewood, tobacco, and safety. It was smaller than Eli remembered, but somehow heavier, as if time had laid its full weight upon the roof. He walked forward slowly, boots pressing deep into the untouched snow. The air smelled of cedar and rust. When he reached the porch, he ran his hand along the rail, rough, splintered, cold. Beneath the decay, he felt the faint pulse of memory. He could almost hear Thomas's laughter, that low, patient sound that always followed advice. "Come back when the war inside you is done," the old man had said. But Eli knew now, wars didn't end, they just changed shape. He turned the door handle, It groaned, stiff from disuse, and the scent of dust, pine, and old smoke drifted out. The interior was dim, light slipping through warped shutters. Dust floated in the air like ghosts refusing to settle. The furniture was still in place, the stone fireplace stacked with gray logs, a small table beside it with a chipped mug and a rusted lantern. Everything looked exactly as it had been left, as if Thomas had simply stepped out and never returned. Ranger moved first, padding inside with careful steps, his nails tapping lightly on the wooden floor. His nose brushed against the corners, sniffing, tracing stories long gone. Eli followed, his boots creaking softly. He placed his hand on the wall, solid pine, still strong beneath years of neglect. On the mantel above the fireplace lay a small envelope, edges yellowed with time. The handwriting on the front was familiar, neat, deliberate, unmistakable. For Eli. He hesitated, then opened it. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. The lodge is yours now. She's old and weary, but her heart's still good. Maybe like us. Don't sell her, fix her. You'll find what you need in the basement, trust your instincts, and trust that dog. Uncle Thomas." Eli's throat tightened. His uncle's voice seemed to echo through the empty room, warm even in absence. He folded the note carefully and placed it in his coat pocket, then crouched beside Ranger. "Looks like the old man's given us a job," he murmured. Ranger tilted his head, tail giving one slow wag. The next few hours blurred into motion. Eli opened the windows, swept away cobwebs, and fed dry wood into the fireplace. He found old photographs on a shelf, Thomas standing with soldiers outside the lodge in its younger days. Faces, bright, uniforms clean, the world still full of promise. In one photo, Eli himself appeared, 18, grinning, unaware of how quickly youth fades. As the fire crackled, he noticed the narrow door near the kitchen, painted over, but clearly leading downward. A brass padlock hung there, tarnished yet unbroken. The key dangled from a nail above, as if left for him. For a long time, he stood staring at it. The note's words came back. "You'll find what you need in the basement." He turned the key. The padlock clicked open, and the door creaked as it swung inward, exhaling a breath of cold earth. The scent of soil, oil, and iron drifted up. He took the flashlight from the shelf and shone it down the steps. The beam cut through dust like fog. The basement was cramped but orderly. Boxes lined the walls, labeled in Thomas's handwriting. Tools, supplies, receipts. In one corner sat a single wooden crate, newer than the rest, marked with one word, Ranger. Eli frowned, stepping closer. Ranger followed, ears high, tail still. The lid wasn't nailed shut, only latched. Eli's heart thudded as he lifted it open. Inside lay a collection of objects, an old military tag, a folded flag, and a sealed envelope resting atop a worn leather collar. On the collar, engraved in brass, was Ranger's name. A note was attached, written in that same firm hand. "Not all things we save are meant for war. Some are meant for healing." TC. Eli's chest tightened. He sat there for a long time, the glow of the flashlight flickering across his face. He thought of the long nights in the desert, how Ranger had pulled him from wreckage, how his uncle's letters had been the only words that reached him after friends stopped writing. He realized then that this place, this dog, and this moment were all pieces of the same truth. Thomas had been preparing him not to survive, but to rebuild. Eli replaced the collar gently, closed the crate, and turned off the light. The darkness didn't feel as suffocating anymore. As he climbed the stairs, Ranger brushed past him, leading the way like always. He sat by the fireplace again, warming his hands. Ranger lay beside him, chin on his paws, eyes half closed. Outside, snow fell soundlessly through the pines, and the firelight painted the walls gold. Eli stared into the flames, feeling something stir inside him. Not joy, not sadness, but a quiet resolve. "This place isn't dead," he whispered almost to himself. "It's just waiting." Ranger's ear twitched in reply, as if he understood. And for the first time in years, the silence felt like peace. The mountains woke before the dawn, restless and rumbling beneath a rising wind. The air grew heavy, pressing low over the ridges of Pine Ridge like a warning whispered by the trees. By the time Eli Carter stepped outside, the world had already turned gray and sharp, the kind of morning that smelled of iron and snow. He was patching the roof again, not out of duty, but instinct. The storm had shifted overnight, and the wind now blew from the north, slicing through the seams of the lodge. Each hammer strike echoed across the valley, clean and steady. The rhythm of a man who only knew how to keep things from falling apart. Below, Ranger paced the porch, his thick sable coat ruffled by the wind. The German shepherd was restless, ears twitching toward the forest, nose raised to sense the human couldn't name. Eli glanced down, smiling faintly. "We'll beat it, old boy," he muttered. "Just a few more nails." But the storm was already there. The wind roared through the trees, snow sweeping sideways in silver sheets. Within minutes, the mountain blurred into white chaos. Eli tightened the last board, climbed down, and barely caught the faintest sound. A cry, stretched thin through the howl of the blizzard. Ranger's head snapped up. One bark, sharp as a gunshot, then another. He lunged toward the woods. Eli's gut clenched. "Wait, Ranger!" He pulled his parka tight and ran, boots breaking through the deepening snow. The forest swallowed him whole, the cold clawing at his lungs. He could barely see beyond his arm's reach, but Ranger's shape cut through the white, a shadow moving with purpose. Then came another cry, weaker now, followed by the sound of something collapsing. Eli stumbled over a half-buried branch and saw her, curled in the snow, one leg twisted beneath her, a wool hat barely clinging to her head. Ranger was already there, pressing close, shielding her from the wind. "Hey!" Eli called out, kneeling. "Don't move, I've got you." Her eyes fluttered open, dark hazel, ringed with exhaustion. She looked around in confusion, face red from the cold, strands of chestnut hair sticking to her cheeks. "I lost the road," she said, voice shaking. "The storm came faster than I thought." "You're lucky he found you," Eli said, nodding toward Ranger. "Can you stand?" She tried, grimacing. "I think so." He slipped his arm under hers and lifted. She was tall, maybe 5'7", lean under her heavy coat, the posture of someone used to standing in front of others, commanding quietly. Her breath came in ragged clouds. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere warm." They pushed against the wind together, following Ranger's tracks back through the storm. Twice she stumbled, and twice he caught her, saying nothing. Her glove slipped once, and he saw her hand, small, pale, fingers ink-stained. Not a traveler, not a hiker, a worker of words. When they reached the lodge, Eli slammed, the door behind them, sealing out the world's fury, heat from the fireplace wrapped around them, the kind that burned slow and deep. The woman dropped to a chair near the hearth, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. "You're safe," Eli said, hanging his coat. "Coffee's coming up." Her eyes followed him, alert despite exhaustion. "You don't talk much, do you?" "Not unless I have to." That earned a faint smile. "I'm Maya Brooks. Eli Carter. Like the Carter who owns this lodge? Something like that." She laughed softly, rubbing warmth back into her hands. "Well, Eli Carter, you just saved a very ungraceful schoolteacher." He raised an eyebrow. "Schoolteacher?" "Yes, down in Timber Hollow. Small class, big noise." She took the mug he offered and wrapped both hands around it. "I stayed too long grading essays and thought I could beat the storm." Her voice carried a melody, gentle, worn, the kind that could calm children or quiet a room. Her hair, now drying by the fire, curled slightly at the ends. Her cheeks were soft, not painted, and her coat still smelled faintly of chalk dust and books. There was steadiness in her that reminded Eli of people who survived not by fighting, but by enduring. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Eli said. She shrugged. "You live up here alone." "Different kind of alone." Maya studied him a moment longer, then turned her gaze to the fire. "You know," she said softly, "quiet can heal or hurt. Depends on who's listening." Eli looked away. "Yeah, I know." They didn't speak for a while. The lodge creaked in the wind, the fire cracked, and Ranger settled between them like a living hearthstone, his head resting on his paws. Later, as the storm thickened, Maya helped dry her coat by the fire, while Eli fixed a loose shutter. "This place feels alive," she said, "like it remembers things." "It does," Eli replied. "My uncle built it, took care of soldiers who needed rest more than medicine." He sounds like someone who understood people. He did, Eli said, voice thinning. More than I did. The storm raged long into the night. When Maya grew too tired to sit, Eli brought her an old quilt. You'll be safe here, he said. Roads won't clear till morning. Thank you for everything. Don't thank me, thank him. He nodded toward Ranger, who blinked sleepily. By morning, the world outside had gone still. A pale sun burned weakly through the snow haze. Maya stood by the window, her reflection faint in the glass. It's beautiful, she whispered. How something so cruel can look so pure after. That's how these mountains work, Eli said. They break you, then they show you peace. She smiled, then turned. I'll have to head back before the next storm. But before I go, if you ever need something to fix that isn't a roof, the school's furnace is dying, and the floor creaks like it's got secrets. Maybe you could take a look. Eli hesitated, a faint echo of his uncle's voice whispering through his thoughts. Fix what's broken. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I ask. When she finally left, Ranger followed her tracks to the tree line and stood watching until she disappeared. Eli returned to the lodge, the silence heavier now, but not hollow. On the table near the fire sat a brown leather satchel. He opened it gently. Inside were lesson plans, children's drawings, and a note in a child's handwriting. Ms. Brooks is brave. Eli traced the words with his thumb and smiled. Yeah, he murmured, she is. Outside, the snow began to melt off the roof, dripping slowly like a heartbeat, restarting after years of silence. The morning after Maya's departure dawned pale and still, the kind of quiet that felt watchful rather than peaceful. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the heavy air. The mountains glistened with new snow that sparkled like powdered glass under the sun. Inside Pine Ridge Lodge, the fire had gone cold, leaving behind only the faint smell of ash and pine smoke. Eli Carter stood by the window, mug in hand, eyes tracing the curve of the valley road that vanished into the trees. On the table beside him lay Maya's leather satchel. It had sat there all night, untouched. Ranger, sprawled by the hearth, raised his head, following Eli's gaze. Yeah, Eli muttered, rubbing his jaw. I know. She'll want this back. He hesitated before leaving. For years, leaving anywhere had been hard. Out there was noise, people, the world he'd tried to forget. But something about Maya's quiet gratitude the night before had cut through his walls. He grabbed the satchel, shrugged on his coat, and stepped outside. Ranger trotted close behind, his paws crunching in the thin crust of snow. The road toward Timber Hollow twisted through pine forest and low ridges. The air carried the scent of thawing sap and wet bark. Eli didn't get far before he saw smoke rising between the trees, a thin gray plume, too steady to be wild. He followed it until the shape of a cabin appeared, small but sturdy, built from rough-hewn logs darkened by age. Outside, a man was splitting wood with practiced rhythm, the swing of the axe as precise as a heartbeat. Eli stopped a few yards away. Morning, he called. The man looked up but didn't stop working. He was in his late 60s, broad-shouldered and still solid despite the years. His hair was iron gray, thick around the temples, and a beard like steel wool covered his jaw. Deep creases carved across his forehead and around his eyes, the kind made by decades of sunlight and frowning. His movements were efficient, unhurried. Morning, the man replied, voice gravelly but strong. You're not from down the ridge. No, Eli said, stepping closer. Name's Carter, Eli Carter. The axe paused mid-swing. The man's eyes, gray-green and sharp, studied him for a long moment. Carter, he repeated slowly. Thomas's boy? Eli blinked, caught off guard. His nephew, yeah. You knew him? The man finally set the axe aside, wiping his hands on his worn flannel shirt. Name's Frank Dawson. Used to help your uncle build that lodge of his. Must have been 40 years ago, give or take. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Didn't think anyone was left to look after the place. Eli nodded, adjusting his coat. Didn't either, till he left it to me. Frank grunted. Figures. He always said that place would come back to family. He motioned toward a tree stump near the chopping block. Sit, if you're not in a rush. Coffee's on the stove. Won't kill you, probably. Inside the cabin, warmth radiated from a small wood stove. The space smelled of cedar and oil, with shelves lined by hand tools and half-finished carvings. A single photograph hung near the door. 2 young soldiers leaning on a jeep, grinning at the camera. One of them, unmistakably Thomas Carter. The other, Eli realized, was Frank, younger and leaner, his grin wide, his eyes reckless. Frank noticed him looking. "France 1971, he said. "We were maintenance crew, keeping old trucks alive long after they wanted to die. Thomas could fix anything with wire and prayer." His tone softened briefly. "Hell of a man." Eli smiled faintly. "Yeah, he was." Ranger settled quietly near the door, tail flicking once before curling around himself. Frank eyed the dog. "That your mutt?" "German Shepherd," Eli said. "Name's Ranger, served with me overseas." Frank's gaze lingered, something flickering behind the roughness. "Had one like that once. Max, smartest damn animal I ever knew. Took shrapnel for me back in Kuwait." He took a long breath. "Didn't make it home, though." For a moment, the silence between them thickened, not uncomfortable, but understood. Eli nodded. "Sorry." "Don't be," Frank said, waving it off. He was a better soldier than most men I knew. He poured 2 cups of coffee, black and bitter. "So, what brings you out my way? You don't strike me as the social type." Eli placed Maya's satchel on the table. "A teacher stayed at the lodge during the storm, Maya Brooks. She forgot this. Figured someone in town might know how to reach her." Frank scratched his beard. "Maya? Sure, teaches at Timber Hollow School. Comes through here Fridays. You can leave it with me if you like." Eli shook his head. "I'll bring it myself." Frank studied him over the rim of his mug. "You're a lot like your uncle, stubborn enough to fix what doesn't ask to be fixed." "That's so?" "Yeah," Frank said, leaning back in his chair. "He built that lodge not just for rest, but for men like us. Said soldiers don't come home, they just change uniforms. Wanted to make it a place where the broken could learn to be human again." He snorted softly. "I told him it was a fool's dream." Eli looked into his cup, the dark surface rippling. "He left me a note, said not to sell it, said to fix it." Frank's eyes lifted. "Then maybe you're the fool who finishes what he started." They spent the afternoon working outside. Frank showed Eli the old lumber mill at the edge of his property, rusted machines, a few still running, belts groaning with effort. "Still use it for small jobs," he said. "The world thinks old wood's useless till someone sees what it can be." He handed Eli a chisel, rough-handled and stained with years of use. "Try it. The trick's not cutting. It's listening." Eli pressed the blade to the wood, slow and careful, carving away thin curls that fell like shavings of memory. Frank nodded approvingly. "You've got steady hands. Guess the Corps didn't take that from you." They worked in companionable silence until the sun dipped low, setting the snowfields ablaze in copper light. Before Eli left, Frank stepped to the edge of the porch and said quietly, "If you need lumber or help, I'm a few miles up. Not much company out here otherwise." Eli gave a nod. "Appreciate it." "Don't thank me yet," Frank grumbled. "I charge double for greenhorns." Then, after a pause, "And coffee's extra." For the first time in years, Eli laughed, short, quiet, but real. When he and Ranger returned to the lodge, twilight had already settled over the mountains. The air hummed with the cold, but it felt lighter somehow. Eli lit the lamp by the window and set the satchel gently back on the table. He noticed for the first time a photograph pinned behind the frame. Thomas standing beside Frank and several young soldiers, the lodge behind them newly built. The caption, in faded ink, read, "Pine Ridge Lodge, 1981. Built for those still fighting inside." Eli's throat tightened. He knelt beside Ranger, scratching behind the dog's ear. "You hear that, buddy? Guess this place wasn't just his dream." Ranger looked up, amber eyes reflecting the firelight. And Eli could almost imagine the old lodge breathing again, one board, one nail, one memory at a time. Dusk came slow to the mountains that evening, the sky folding itself into shades of pewter and pale rose before the snow began again. Pine Ridge Lodge glowed like a small ember against the gray, its windows spilling warm, golden light into the white silence. Inside, the rhythmic sound of a hammer echoed faintly from the back room where Eli and Frank were bent over a half-finished shelf. The place smelled of sawdust, oil, and pine resin. the scent of work that carried both memory and purpose. Frank Dawson, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, worked with the steady patience of someone who had been building things all his life. His hands were large and rough, scarred in old lines that no tool could smooth. Even with his gruff exterior, there was precision in the way he shaped wood, as though he respected it. He had the posture of a man carved from the same material, broad, square-shouldered, immovable. Every now and then, he would glance toward Eli, assessing, but never saying much unless needed. Eli Carter, meanwhile, moved with quiet focus. He wore the same beige flannel shirt rolled at the cuffs, the fabric soft from years of use. There was something almost ritualistic in his movements: measure, mark, cut, repeat. Ranger lay nearby, head resting on his paws, occasionally lifting his eyes to follow the men's slow rhythm. Outside, the wind began to whisper through the trees, the first flakes falling against the window like tapping fingers. Frank grunted as he fitted the shelf's final plank. "You ever notice," he said, voice rough but calm, "how fixing a place ain't about wood or nails? It's about making the noise stop." Eli looked up. "Noise?" Frank met his gaze for a second before focusing on the shelf again. "Yeah, the kind you can't hear, but you feel here." He tapped his chest. "Used to wake up hearing it every damn night. My wife used to shake me out of it till she couldn't anymore." Eli didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. The silence between them said enough. The sound of a car engine broke through the quiet, distant but growing. Frank straightened, frowning. "You expecting anyone?" Eli wiped his hands on a rag. "No." Headlights appeared briefly through the trees before vanishing behind a drift. Moments later, there was a knock, soft, hurried. Ranger lifted his head and barked once, tail thumping. Eli opened the door to find Maya Brooks, cheeks flushed red from the cold, hair loose from her wool hat. Her brown eyes widened as she saw him. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to interrupt. She held up her gloved hands, flustered. "I realized this morning I left my teaching bag here. I didn't think anyone would still be up." Ranger trotted forward with a bark of recognition, brushing against her coat as if to confirm it was really her. Maya laughed softly and crouched to pet him. "You remember me, huh?" From behind, Frank leaned against the workbench, watching with mild amusement. "Looks like he remembers you better than I remember what day it is," he said. Maya glanced toward the older man. "I don't think we've met." Frank wiped his hands on a rag before stepping closer. "Frank Dawson used to work with Thomas, Eli's uncle. These two were trying to make the roof stop complaining." "It's nice to meet you," she said warmly. Her voice carried that natural kindness that softened even Frank's edges. "Sorry for the interruption." Frank waved it off. "No interruption. This place has been quiet too long. A little noise won't hurt." Eli found the satchel near the fireplace, resting where he'd left it days ago. He handed it to her. "Guess this belongs to you." Her relief showed in her shoulders. "You have no idea how many lesson plans were in there. Thank you." Ranger's tail wagged harder as she slung the strap over her shoulder. "It's warm in here," she said, glancing around. "And it smells like sawdust and home." "Coffee's still hot," Frank said. "You drove through snow for a bag. You've earned a cup." Maya hesitated, then smiled. "Well, maybe just one." She sat near the fireplace while the men cleaned up their tools. The glow of the fire painted her face in soft amber tones. She looked around the lodge, its mismatched chairs, the old photos, the faint hum of the kettle, and her expression softened. "This place has stories," she said. "You can feel them." Eli nodded. "Some are worth remembering, some not so much." Frank poured 3 mugs and joined them. "Thomas wanted it to be more than a building," he said, his voice deep but thoughtful. "Said every broken man needed somewhere his ghost couldn't find him. Guess that's why he built it here. Too high, too quiet." Maya listened, eyes flicking between them. "He sounds like someone who understood pain and what to do with it." "He did," Frank replied. "But he didn't talk about it, just built through it. Kinda like this one here." He nodded toward Eli. Eli didn't respond, but the corner of his mouth lifted briefly, a small acknowledgement. Snow thickened outside, cloaking the windows in white. The world beyond disappeared, leaving only the glow of the fire and the creak of the lodge settling into the storm. When the wind howled, Maya shivered slightly. I might wait a bit before driving back, she said. I can't even see the road. You'll stay until it eases, Eli said simply. Frank added, Besides, you might as well earn your keep. We got a pile of old boxes full of your school's favorite subject, history. They spent the next hour sorting through dusty papers and faded photographs Thomas had left in a trunk by the wall. Maya knelt beside Ranger, who occasionally sniffed through the piles, tail wagging. He's good at this, she said. He finds things I miss, Eli replied. Most of the papers were old letters, building permits, or yellowed maps of the property. But at the bottom of one box, Maya pulled out a roll of parchment tied with twine. This one's different, she said, handing it to Eli. He untied it carefully. The paper was brittle, lined with blue ink sketches, rooms, corridors, names. Across the top, in neat handwriting, were the words, Veterans Healing Lodge, Proposal, 1981. Frank leaned closer, reading aloud. A retreat for veterans and their families, a place for rebuilding what was lost. His voice faltered for a second before he cleared his throat. Damn. He never told me he wrote this down. Eli's eyes scanned the plans, the layout, the notes in the margins. The project was far more than a cabin. It was an entire vision. Therapy rooms, workshops, gardens, even kennels labeled companion training area. He felt his chest tighten. Maya traced the drawings with one gloved finger. He must have believed it was possible. Frank took a long breath, his voice low. Thomas didn't build for money. He built for people. Maybe he left this because he knew someone would need it. Eli looked from the page to the fire, the light flickering in his eyes. Then maybe it's time someone did something about it. No one spoke after that. The silence felt full, heavy, but alive. Ranger shifted beside Eli, resting his head on his knee, as if to second the thought. Outside, the wind slowed, and the snow eased into a soft, steady fall. Maya stayed until it was safe to drive, but before she left, she stood by the door and said quietly, I think he'd be proud of what you're doing, both of you. Frank pretended to adjust his gloves, muttering, He'd tell us to work faster. Eli smiled faintly. Maybe, but I think he'd be glad we're trying. When she was gone, the lodge felt different, still quiet, but charged with something new. Eli looked down at the blueprint again, at the faded ink that carried a dream bigger than one man. He folded it carefully and placed it back on the table. Ranger lay near the door, tail thumping once before he drifted into sleep. Eli stood by the window, watching the snow fall beneath the golden light. For the first time, Pine Ridge Lodge didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a beginning. Spring crept into Pine Ridge quietly, like a shy guest afraid to knock. The snow didn't vanish all at once. It receded in soft, uneven patches, leaving behind glistening soil and rivulets that whispered their way down the slope. The pine trees breathed again, their needles glinting with dew under the first kind sunlight. The air carried the scent of thawing earth, oil, and sawdust, because at Pine Ridge Lodge, work had already begun. Eli Carter stood in front of the lodge, sleeves rolled, hammer in hand. His once pale face had color again, touched by sunlight and movement. The deep lines around his eyes had softened, not gone, but lived in. He moved with quiet purpose, the kind that comes not from orders, but from conviction. Every nail he drove in was steadier than the last, and beside him, Ranger followed faithfully, a silent shadow in sable and gold. The German shepherd was older now, the fur around his muzzle flecked with white, but his eyes remained bright and alert. Whenever Eli's hands trembled, whenever the echoes of the past tried to crawl back in, Ranger would press his head gently against Eli's knee until the storm inside him passed. "Hold it steady, kid," Frank called from the scaffolding. The old carpenter, now stripped of winter layers, looked stronger than men half his age. His arms were thick, veins like tree roots beneath tanned skin. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled, and sawdust clung to his beard like frost. "You're holding that beam like it's a snake, not a plank." Eli smirked faintly. "You complain more than my drill," Frank grunted. "Your drill doesn't talk back." From the garden area, laughter rose, light, musical, unmistakably human. Maya Brooks stood among a group of teenagers, her hair loose in the breeze, sleeves rolled up as she painted the old fence. Her cheeks were flushed from the sun, her hands smudged with streaks of white paint. "I heard that!" she shouted toward them. If anyone complains more than the drill, it's Frank Dawson. Frank shot a look over his shoulder, feigning indignation. And I see we've got comedians now. What are they teaching you in that school, Brooks? Patience, she called back, grinning. Something you could use more of. The crew of volunteers, students, a few parents, and even 2 retired veterans from Timber Hollow laughed as they continued their work. Among them was Tommy Jenkins, a lanky 16-year-old with freckles and a baseball cap far too big for his head. He was quiet, shy, but worked hard without being told. His mother, Rachel Jenkins, helped alongside Maya, her short auburn hair tied up messily, her hands surprisingly skilled with a paintbrush. She was a nurse at the local clinic, the type who smiled often but carried tired eyes, like she'd seen too many people hurt and not enough healed. Rachel turned to Maya as she rinsed a brush. "You know, I never thought I'd see this place alive again," she said softly. "My dad used to come here back when Thomas ran it. Said it was the only place that felt peaceful after the war." Maya's expression softened. "That's exactly what we want it to be again." Inside the lodge, sunlight spilled through freshly cleaned windows, landing on a patchwork of sawdust and new flooring. The rooms were slowly taking shape, one to serve as a reading area, another as a small workshop, and the largest hall repurposed for community gatherings. Old photos of Thomas Carter and other veterans were being restored by hand, framed, and hung on the walls. Eli stood near one of the frames, staring at a black and white image of soldiers sitting by the same fireplace that now flickered behind him. He recognized his uncle, taller than he remembered, smiling faintly. Next to him, a young man looked almost identical to Eli himself. "That's your father," Frank said quietly, stepping beside him. "Thomas told me once he was the brave one, never made it home." Eli nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I was 8, don't remember much." Frank patted his shoulder, rough but gentle. "Then remember this instead. He'd have been damn proud of you." Eli didn't answer. His throat felt too tight to trust words. Ranger brushed against his leg, grounding him in the present moment. The hum of voices outside, the scent of pine and paint, the faint laughter of children. By afternoon, the sun dipped low, painting the valley in honey-colored light. Maya gathered everyone around the porch for a break. She passed out lemonade in mismatched mugs and sandwiches wrapped in paper. The air buzzed with warmth and fatigue, the good kind that follows honest work. Tommy sat near Ranger, feeding him bits of bread. "He's huge," the boy said, eyes wide. "Does he bite?" "Only if you spell dog with a C," Frank replied from behind, chuckling. Maya rolled her eyes. "Ignore him, Tommy. Ranger's gentle, right, boy?" Ranger wagged his tail once, leaning into Eli's leg. The boy grinned and scratched his ear. Rachel looked around the lodge, her eyes soft. "You've done something incredible here, Eli. People needed this." Eli shook his head. "Thomas did. We're just finishing what he started." "No," Maya said quietly. "You gave it life. That's something the dead can't do." The words hung there, simple, honest, cutting through Eli's silence like sunlight through fog. He met her gaze briefly and something unspoken passed between them. Understanding, respect, maybe something that could one day grow into more. As dusk fell, the volunteers packed up. Maya stayed behind with Eli and Frank to finish the last touches inside. They arranged chairs near the fireplace and stacked supplies along the wall. When Maya reached for a paint can, her fingers brushed Eli's wrist. They both froze for a heartbeat. Then she smiled faintly, stepping back. "You know," she said, "for someone who claims he doesn't like people, you're doing a pretty good job bringing them together." Eli looked at the glowing fire. "I'm not sure I'm bringing them together. Maybe they were always meant to be here." "Then maybe you were too," she said softly. Later, when Frank had left for the night and Maya drove down the mountain, Eli stayed behind, sitting by the hearth with Ranger at his feet. The fire crackled low, casting gold across the room. He picked up one of Thomas's old blueprints, the Veterans Healing Lodge plans they'd found, and studied the handwriting. "Guess we're getting there, old man," he murmured. Outside, the night was calm. The stars blinked faintly through drifting clouds. Ranger shifted, his head resting on Eli's knee, the steady rhythm of his breathing a quiet metronome against the hum of memory. For the first time in years, Eli realized he wasn't just fixing wood and walls. He was fixing himself. And maybe, in doing so, he was helping others find what he'd nearly lost. A reason to keep going. The last of spring's frost melted from the rooftops by morning, and Pine Ridge breathed in the first warm winds of May. The air carried a blend of pine resin, fresh soil, and the faint sweetness of wild lilac. Birds sang again along the valley slopes, their calls threading through the mist that curled lazily over the trees. The lodge stood proud now, no longer a ruin swallowed by time, but a living place with laughter and life inside its wooden ribs. Yet for Eli Carter, the warmth of spring couldn't quiet the unease that had settled in his chest since the letter arrived. It came in a plain brown envelope, stamped with an insignia he hadn't seen in years, an eagle over crossed rifles, the emblem of the U.S. Army Training Command. He'd found it wedged in the lodge mailbox that morning, its corners slightly damp from Mountain Dew. The handwriting was formal, impersonal, the kind that carried authority instead of emotion. Sergeant Eli Carter, you are hereby invited to return as a combat training instructor. Your service record and leadership experience are highly valued. This position offers full reinstatement and veterans benefits. Report date pending your confirmation. Eli sat at the kitchen table, staring at the words long after the fire had gone cold. His reflection stared back at him in the window. Lean face, silver threads in his beard, eyes tired yet sharp. He traced a finger over his name like it belonged to someone else. For years, the Army had been his only language, his rhythm, his reason. And now, it was calling him back. Ranger sat at his feet, tail thumping softly once, then stilling, sensing his master's tension. You think they really want me back? Eli murmured. The dog tilted his head, eyes amber and knowing. Yeah, Eli sighed. Me neither. By mid-morning, Frank Dawson arrived in his usual cloud of sawdust and tobacco scent. He was carrying a bucket of nails and a rolled blueprint under one arm. His flannel shirt was buttoned crookedly, his beard flecked with gray and streaks of dried sap. Morning, he grunted. You look like a man who just saw a ghost. Eli slid the letter across the table. Frank read it silently, his expression unreadable, then set it down and scratched his chin. Huh. They still remember old soldiers like us? Apparently, Eli said flatly. They want me to train recruits, Arizona base. Frank leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You thinking about it? I don't know, Eli admitted. Part of me misses it, the order, the purpose. But then, he gestured toward the window where Maya and a few kids were painting a birdhouse outside. There's this. Feels like the first real thing I've built that isn't meant for fighting. Frank nodded slowly. War gives you direction, but peace asks you to choose one. Maya Brooks stepped inside just then, brushing her hands on her jeans, her cheeks flushed from the wind. Frank, you forgot your hammer again, she teased, holding it up. Then noticing Eli's expression, her smile faltered. Everything okay? Eli hesitated before handing her the letter. She read it quietly, lips pressing into a line. They want you back, she said softly. They think I can still teach men how to fight, Eli replied. I'm not sure I can even teach myself how to stop. She folded the letter carefully, setting it back down. Sometimes going back isn't strength, Eli. Sometimes staying is. Before he could answer, the phone on the wall rang. An old rotary line Frank had restored last winter. Maya picked it up, her brow furrowed. It's for me. She turned slightly, her voice dropping. Yes, I understand. I'll think about it. After a few moments, she hung up and stared at the floor. Frank arched a brow. Trouble? She shook her head, but didn't meet their eyes. Not trouble. Opportunity. The district office offered me a position. Teaching in Denver, full-time, better pay, better facilities. Eli felt his stomach sink. That's good news, right? I guess, she said softly. It's what every teacher wants, but I don't know if I can leave this place, leave you guys. Frank chuckled. Well, isn't that a fine mess? Two fools who don't know where they belong. Eli managed a faint smile. Guess we're all standing between old lives and new ones. Frank's tone softened. You know, the real battlefield's not out there. He tapped his chest. It's in here. It's about learning to stay when every part of you wants to run. The days stretched on with quiet heaviness. Eli spent the afternoon repairing the garden fence while Maya worked with the children. He watched her kneel beside little Tommy, showing him how to plant marigolds without crushing the roots. Her hair caught the sunlight like strands of chestnut gold. And for a brief second, Eli forgot the letter, the army, the noise in his head. There was only this moment, a woman teaching life to grow again. That night, the wind turned colder, and the moon rose thin and pale above the ridge. The lodge was quiet except for the occasional creak of settling wood. Eli couldn't sleep. He lay staring at the ceiling, the letter still sitting on the nightstand, like a ghost he couldn't ignore. Somewhere in his dreams, the war returned. Sand and fire, a blinding explosion, the sound of someone shouting his name through static. Ranger barked in the distance, but even that seemed to echo from another world. He woke gasping, heart pounding, sweat cold against his back. When he sat up, the room was still dark, except for the faint glow of firelight from the main hall. He followed it silently, feet bare on the wooden floor. There, beside the fireplace, sat Maya and Ranger. She wore a thick knit sweater, her hair falling loose over her shoulders, eyes reflecting the flames. Ranger lay half asleep with his head on her lap, his chest rising in steady rhythm. She looked up as Eli entered. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "Bad dream. War again?" He nodded. She patted the seat beside her. "Sit." He did. For a while, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, throwing amber light across their faces. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, whispering like an old memory trying to fade. Maya finally spoke. "You once told me you came back here because this was the only place that ever felt like home. Maybe that's not just because of the lodge. Maybe it's because you needed to remember what peace feels like." Eli looked at her, her face calm, illuminated by flickering gold. "Peace feels a lot like this," he murmured. "Then stay," she whispered. Ranger lifted his head, pressing his muzzle against Eli's knee, eyes soft, unspoken, loyal. The simple weight of it grounded him more than any therapy ever had. Eli reached down, running a hand through the dog's fur. "Guess I already know my answer," he said quietly. The firelight danced across the old blueprints still hanging by the mantel. Veterans Healing Lodge. Thomas's handwriting seemed almost to glow. Eli felt it then, a realization not born from duty, but from belonging. The army had taught him how to fight. Pine Ridge was teaching him how to live. When the embers dimmed, Maya leaned her head gently against his shoulder. Ranger sighed and closed his eyes. Outside, the pines whispered, and the night, for once, didn't echo with war. Eli's thoughts settled like dust after a long battle. He finally understood what Frank meant, that not every soldier's war ends with a bullet. Some wars end in choosing to stay, to rebuild, to love. And as dawn approached beyond the frost-covered glass, Eli Carter made his choice, to remain where healing had begun, and to fight only for the peace he'd found. The summer sun spilled gently over the ridges of Pine Ridge, turning the valley gold. A light breeze moved through the tall grass, carrying the scent of pine and cut wood. The sound of laughter echoed faintly from the lodge below, the kind of laughter that came from people who had learned to breathe again. 1 year had passed since Eli Carter chose to stay, and in that time, the Pine Ridge Lodge had transformed from a place of quiet ghosts into a living sanctuary. From the outside, the building looked both new and old, its timber bones sanded smooth, windows gleaming, the porch railings lined with flower boxes. Yet the essence of the place, the history soaked into every beam and nail, remained untouched. A carved sign now hung above the entryway, polished and simple. Pine Ridge Lodge, healing through hands and hearts. It was Maya's idea, though Frank had been the one to carve it. Inside, the rhythm of life moved with purpose. Veterans arrived each morning, some limping, some scarred, all carrying the invisible weight of things they'd seen and couldn't forget. They worked in the workshops Frank supervised, building furniture, carving small wooden toys, or crafting frames for the photographs that now covered the walls. Frank Dawson had aged a little in the past year, but in a way that made him look even more solid, like oak left out in the sun. His beard had turned completely gray, and his shoulders had lost a hint of their width, yet his eyes carried a steady spark. He moved through the workshop with quiet authority, his rough hands guiding the younger veterans. Sand with the grain, he'd remind them, his voice still gravelly, but gentler now. And remember, the goal ain't to erase the scars, it's to smooth them. Down the hall, the sound of children reading filled what had once been the main dining room. Maya Brooks, now the lodge's full-time education director, sat at a wooden table surrounded by 6 students. Her long brown hair was pulled into a loose braid, a pencil tucked behind her ear, and sunlight from the high windows softened the freckles across her cheeks. The children, sons and daughters of veterans, and a few from nearby families, listened as she guided them through stories of courage, hope, and forgiveness. Her calm voice carried warmth. "What do you think this story means?" she asked, smiling toward a shy girl named Lily. The child's small fingers fidgeted with the edge of her book before she said, "It means, even when you're scared, you can still be kind." "Exactly," Maya said softly, glancing toward the doorway where Eli stood watching. "Sometimes kindness is braver than fighting." Eli smiled faintly, leaning against the doorframe. The past year had changed him in quiet ways. His beard was shorter, his eyes clearer. The nightmares still came, but less often, and when they did, Ranger was always there, pressing his weight against Eli's chest, until his breathing steadied. Eli wore simpler clothes now, worn denim, an old brown work jacket that still smelled faintly of cedar. After the lessons, he and Maya walked together outside. The air was warm, the valley stretching wide before them. Volunteers and visitors worked around the lodge, tending the vegetable garden, cleaning tools, feeding the dogs in the training pen. The dogs were a new addition, a part of the lodge's therapy companion program, started 6 months earlier. Ranger, now 8 years old, led the group of German Shepherds, Labradors, and mixed breeds that had been rescued and retrained to assist veterans with trauma and anxiety. Though slower these days, he still carried himself like a guardian. His coat had faded slightly, but his eyes burned bright as ever. Whenever a new dog arrived, nervous, withdrawn, Ranger would approach, nudge their shoulder, and lie beside them until they settled. A few of the trainers laughed softly as they watched him. "He's the boss here," one of them said. Eli grinned. "He's more than that. He's the heart." As the afternoon waned, the lodge filled with a gentle hum of activity. Frank supervised a group of teenage apprentices repairing chairs. Maya worked with a veteran named Cal Peterson, a quiet man in his early 40s with close-cropped blonde hair and the cautious posture of someone learning to live among people again. He had been a medic in Afghanistan, and though his hands were still, his eyes sometimes flickered like he was waiting for something to explode. Under Maya's guidance, Cal helped teach first aid classes for local families, finding healing and giving back. Later that day, a small gathering was held in the main hall. The walls were now lined with framed photographs, portraits of those who had come through the lodge, soldiers, families, and the dogs who had helped them heal. Some photos were of faces smiling, others showed rough hands holding newly carved wood, and one large frame hung near the entrance. A black and white image of Thomas and Rose Carter standing before the unfinished lodge decades ago. Eli stood beside Frank and Maya as guests filled the room. He looked at the photo for a long time before speaking quietly. "They started this for men who couldn't find their way home. I think they'd be proud to see what it became." Frank nodded. "They'd say you gave it soul." Eli shook his head. "We did, all of us." Maya took his hand, squeezing gently. "Including him," she said, nodding toward Ranger, who sat near the fire, head raised, ears pricked, as if he understood every word. The evening unfolded with quiet joy. Children played in the yard, veterans shared stories by the fire, and the sound of a harmonica drifted softly from the porch. Frank joined a small group of locals to tell one of his signature stories. Exaggerated, humorous, half-true. Maya served tea from an old kettle, moving from table to table, her laughter weaving through the room. When night finally fell, the guests departed, and the lodge returned to its gentle stillness. Eli stepped onto the porch, the air cool against his skin. Ranger lay beside him, front paws stretched forward, his fur shimmering faintly under the porch light. Maya appeared with 2 mugs of chamomile tea, handing one to Elo before settling beside him. "Long day," she said. "A good one," he replied. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fireflies flicker in the fields. The valley below glowed faintly under the moonlight, and the lights from the lodge spilled across the clearing like a soft halo. Inside, the photographs caught the reflection of the flames, turning the room into a mosaic of faces and memories. Frank's voice drifted faintly from inside, muttering to himself as he cleaned his tools. A familiar rhythm now, comforting as an old song. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called. Maya leaned her head against Eli's shoulder. "Do you ever think," she said quietly, "that some places are alive?" Eli looked out at the lodge, its warm lights, the hum of crickets, Ranger's slow breathing beside them. "Yeah," he said softly, "I think this one's proof." Ranger stirred, resting his head on Eli's boot. The night settled deep around them, calm and timeless. The lights of Pine Ridge Lodge glowed steady against the dark, a beacon for anyone still searching for their way home. Within its walls were no soldiers, no ghosts, no grief. Only people learning, one breath at a time, that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means staying. And in that quiet valley beneath the stars, the lodge stood not just as a house, but as a living prayer, built of faith, loyalty, and second chances. In the quiet valley of Pine Ridge, the seasons continued to turn, snow melting into streams, streams feeding the grass, and the grass bending beneath summer winds. The lodge stood through it all, steady as faith itself. What began as one man's return to a forgotten home had become something far greater, a haven not just for soldiers or dogs, but for every soul that ever needed a reason to believe again. People arrived broken and left whole, not because the pain disappeared, but because it was shared. That was the secret. Healing was never about forgetting the past. It was about forgiving yourself enough to live in the present. Eli learned that peace doesn't roar like victory. It whispers like prayer. Maya learned that love doesn't demand, it nurtures. Frank, old and content, learned that teaching others to build was its own kind of redemption. And Ranger, faithful till the end, showed everyone what loyalty looks like when words aren't enough. The Lodge of Light was no longer just wood and stone. It was a living testament to grace. Its windows glowed each night like candles in the dark, a silent message to anyone lost in their own war. You can come home. Perhaps that's how God works, not through thunder or miracles carved in fire, but through small acts of faith that ripple quietly across the years. Through a hand reaching out, through a dog waiting by the door, through the courage to rebuild when everything seems too broken to fix. So, if you're watching this now, wherever you are, whatever you're facing, remember, the light doesn't vanish when life gets hard. It lives in you, in kindness, in loyalty, in every choice to love instead of give up. May God bless you and your family with peace, strength, and new beginnings. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to help keep these stories of faith, hope, and second chances alive. And tonight, before you sleep, whisper a small prayer, not for miracles far away, but for the quiet ones already growing within you. Because sometimes, the greatest miracle isn't being saved. It's learning to live like you already are.